You stay, stay.
Give him a kiss. Move your head.
Closer,
Move your head.
closer.
A snake knows more about what's happening around it than any other creature because it has no ears to listen to gossip, only direct perception. Jagi Vasudev. Snakes, perhaps more than any other creatures, capture the human emotion of fear. Fear due to their oftentimes venomous bites, some of which can kill a grown adult within a matter of minutes. In part because of this, snakes have oftentimes been a symbol of danger, fear, chaos, treachery, and even evil incarnate. However, they have also been depicted as symbols of medicine, healing, and even the gods. If an alien came down to Earth, they would be rather perplexed at how a group of animals of modest size and no legs could induce such terror. In sharp contrast to the vast majority of animals, snakes only have one limb, or at least one usable limb, that is composed of an underside of their entire body. Perhaps their lowly profiles contributed to their oftentimes negative reputation in various human cultures. And this makes sense given that snakes live on nearly every landmass except for the polar regions in a few nations like New Zealand and Ireland. They are also found across vast tropical waters of the Indo-Pacific, but not the Atlantic, in the form of highly venomous sea snakes, which, funny enough, only drink freshwater from rainwater on layers of the surface on top of the ocean. Because the coast of South Africa and Namibia barely has any rain, sea snakes are unable to swim to the Atlantic for long periods of time. In between South America and Antarctica, the water is just too cold, given that snakes are cold-blooded and cannot produce their own body heat. For this reason, the Atlantic is the only other major region on the planet, aside from the polar regions, that is snakeless. Because of how ubiquitous snakes are, they are found in almost every human culture. Today, biologists believe that snakes evolved from lizard species, which for the most part have limbs. Despite having a poor fossil record of snakes, we can see remnants of this in some species of snakes that actually have legs. Left behind is a vestigial structure, which is no longer in significant use, but at one point was used as part of their evolutionary ancestors' physiology. This is rather analogous to the human appendix, which was once used by our ancestors who could eat grass, but today modern humans still have an appendix but don't really use it other than for storing beneficial bacteria. Granted, there are snakes today which have pelvic spurs, such as boas, which they sometimes use as tiny limbs to grasp their mates during sexy time. Granted, those are mini hind legs, as no species of extant snake has front legs. It's worth mentioning that there are also legless lizards which have evolved independently. Unlike snakes, these lizards have eyelids, external openings for ears, and they just by and large look a lot more friendly. However, this doesn't mean that snakes are a simpler version of lizards, as they have more sophisticated forms of locomotion that involve hundreds of ribs, which contract and are attached to connective muscles that, as a result, make the snake a form of an S shape as it moves around. And while there are only 2 venomous species of lizards, there are 3,000 species of venomous snakes. Granted, this is still less than 20% of known snake species in the world. A bite from a ball python or garter snake won't do anything, but one from a cobra, a mamba or a taipan or a viper could lead you to knocking on heaven's door. However, the minority of snakes in the world, which do have deadly venom, have had a profound impact on inducing fear throughout much of human culture, and to this day, a phobia of snakes is one of the most common fears. Although a phobia is an irrational fear, I think that a fear of a cobra is fairly rational. Granted, a fear of a gardener snake is not rational, at least not as rational as that of the black mamba. That's totally rational. This fear is not just limited to humans. Monkeys have an innate fear of snakes, and so do cats. Just look at what happens when a cat mistakes a cucumber for a snake. Early human hunter-gatherers roamed across the savannas of sub-Saharan Africa. They not only probably inherited the fear of snakes from their more primitive primate relatives up in the arboreal world of trees, but also continued to harbor fear of snakes down on the ground as they roamed across the plains. After all, before modern medicine, a snake bite could be a death sentence. While the vast majority of snakes are not venomous, the venomous ones did pretty much ruin the reputation for the rest of them. Furthermore, in sharp contrast to large beasts like lions, bears, crocodiles, and others, snakes are stealthy and could strike you when you least expect. This is probably why we refer to people who betray you when you don't expect as snakes. To be fair, the vast majority of snakes have no intention of killing humans, even venomous ones. After all, with the exception of a very few number of constrictor snakes, like the anaconda, which doesn't actually have any venom, snakes by and large lack the size to consume humans. Constrictor snakes like boas, pythons, and anacondas are, in the vast majority of cases, harmless to humans. There have been a grand total of 2 cases of adult humans being killed by a reticulated python, the longest snake in the world. The heaviest snake in the world, the green anaconda from the Amazon rainforest, has killed a grand total of, you guessed it, 0 people. Yes, at least 0 recorded deaths. This explains why constrictor snakes, while killing their prey through a pretty horrifying manner, just choking them to death, still makes these snakes one of the most popular in the pet trade, as they're pretty docile and gentle when it comes to large organisms like humans, which are just way too big to force down their gullets. If you want to use this inability as an attempt to further demonize snakes, I will note that your cat would kill you if you switch sizes. It'd probably kill you for sport. Now, going back to snake bites, most of the time they bite in self-defense, as opposed to humans who attack for reasons other than self-defense for the most part. Oftentimes when snakes bite, they are mistaking a human for a predator. Unfortunately, this oftentimes happens in the developing world, as many farmers who are working in the fields in the tropics on the ground tend to come into contact with the places that snakes call home. For this reason, snake bites are most prevalent in the tropics and subtropics of rural Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and, to a lesser extent, the drier sub-Saharan African region. These nations, or the nations within these regions more accurately, tend to have substandard medical care in rural areas where snakes are more abundant, and a large portion of the population is composed of commercial farm workers or subsistence farm workers with limited resources. On the other hand, a country like, say, Australia, with some of the most venomous snakes in the world, does not have too many snakebite fatalities, in proportion to the number of venomous snake species. As the economy, after all, is well developed, the healthcare system is robust, and most of the population lives in urban areas on the coasts. Australia is also home to the most venomous snake by far, the inland taipan, with enough toxins to kill 100 adult humans. However, not too many people are actually killed by them, due to the fact that they live in very remote areas, are pretty docile when compared to cobras, pit vipers, and mambas, and by and large just kinda keep to themselves. Snake venom is also pretty diverse, with some acting as neurotoxins targeting the nerve cells that send signals to the brain, others attack the circulatory system making red blood cells burst, others are mitotoxins which stop muscle cells from contracting. Perhaps due to their relative small size and lack of limbs, claws, or beaks, many snakes had to invest in deadly venom to survive. The most notable example of this are the snakes on Snake Island in Brazil. This island is mostly visited by birds, which the snakes have to eat, and only the snakes that could produce enough powerful venom were the ones that were able to kill the birds before they could fly away, and therefore those snakes have very potent venom that could pass on their genes. There have also been cases of non-venomous snakes, like say the scarlet king snake, which mimics the appearance of other snakes that are venomous, like the eastern coral snake. Such is the brilliance of nature. What isn't brilliant are the pastors who play with venomous snakes in the southern United States, namely rattlesnakes. Rattlesnakes are the main source of snake bites in North America, and there is a subculture of hillbilly pastors who pester rattlesnakes, claiming that God will save them from being killed. Which, in a way, is a form of natural selection, in which nature kills the dumbest members of the species. Rattlesnakes, after all, are vipers, which by and large, at least have the decency to give you ample warning through rattling their tails. There are also vipers which can perceive heat. These are called pit vipers. This is helpful when detecting warm-blooded prey, like mice, but less useful for detecting the empty, cold skulls of people who think harassing snakes for Jesus is a hobby. Speaking of Jesus, snakes have found a common place in religion, folklore, and legends across various cultures around the world. The most famous example of this is the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, when a serpent convinces Eve, and indirectly Adam, the first humans, to eat fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, against God's command, thereby leading to them to get kicked out of the Garden of Eden and in turn creating much of the hardship of the human condition. While not literally true, the symbolism and meaning is fascinating, and deserves its own video. However, it's quite interesting that while nearly every other animal in the Garden of Eden is depicted in a positive light, the serpent is the one outlier, again probably stemming from the human innate fear of snakes. After Adam and Eve were kicked out, leading to the fall of man, God also cursed the serpent as well, to crawl on its belly. This seems to imply that the snake was actually walking on limbs, kind of like a lizard would, until God punished them by forcing them to slither on their bellies. Evolving from lizards to snakes. Yeah, the creationist account in the Bible may have gotten the age of the earth wrong, but it sort of kind of got the evolution of lizards to snakes done correctly. What surprises many is that the serpent from the Old Testament in the book of Genesis was not actually referring to the devil originally. This account is arguably retconned in the last book of the Bible, Revelation, as quote, the ancient serpent, or the dragon. He actually was the devil in disguise all along. This would seal the fate of the snake as a symbol of evil in much of the Christian world. The Bible makes other references to serpents and snakes and dragons. For example, there's the Leviathan. The Leviathan is not so much a typical snake, but rather a sea serpent, which is symbolizing mayhem. Like many other stories in the Bible, the Leviathan was partially inspired by the stories from ancient Canaan in Mesopotamia. Leviathan is based off of the Sumerian serpent, Lotan, which is killed by the god of storms. There is even a river in Lebanon named after this serpent, fitting since rivers flow in a rather serpentine way. It is also worth noting that the Leviathan was used as the inspiration for Hobbes' book, The Leviathan, in which he argues that a massive government which controls the people is a way to civilize the population and control man's innate tendencies for mayhem and violence. The government and its rule of law and monopoly on violence would keep check humanity's worst tendencies. If these stories found familiar, it's because they're a common trope in many of the most famous mythologies, such as that of Norse mythology, when Thor, the god of thunder and lightning, battled the Midgard serpent during Ragnarok at the end of the world, and both of them killed each other in the process. Now, if we go back to the Bible, snakes are also mentioned in the book of Exodus, with Moses' staff turning into a snake temporarily to rid the Israelites of their doubt of God. Given that the ancient Israelites were also in close proximity to more advanced civilizations in the Fertile Crescent, it's not a surprise that many of their tales involving serpents and snakes would be directly inspired by the Sumerians, Canaanites, Babylonians, Hittites, and other groups around the world, many of whom viewed snakes as supernatural beings. Despite being feared and sometimes hated, snakes have also been venerated for their potency, power, and beauty. Judeo-Christian depictions of snakes have not always been negative either, by the way. The Gnostics, as they were called by their enemies, were an early Christian sect who focused on overcoming the evils of the material world. Nonetheless, the Gnostics lost out to early Christian interpretations in the theological competition of the early days of the religion, and by and large the reputation of snakes went down the tubes. Outside of the Bible, one of the most famous Christian stories about snakes is the tale of St. Patrick, who had spread Christianity to Ireland, and his namesake is a day that we celebrate by getting drunk, supposedly religiously. He was said to have forced all the snakes to leave Ireland. To the people of the Middle Ages, this explained why Ireland was the only part of Europe outside of some of the most frozen portions of Scandinavia to not have snakes. Granted, the fossil records now show that snakes were never native to Ireland, which is rather unusual given that they're native to almost every landmass on the planet. This partially explains why the Western world, which has been heavily influenced by Christianity as one of its core pillars, tends to view snakes in the negative light. One of the most notable examples of this depiction is that of, well, dragons, which are usually seen as benevolent cultures in Chinese depictions, but oftentimes very, very malicious in Western ones. However, even the Chinese had succumbed to certain anti-snake elements, as during the 2008 Summer Olympics, dragons were downplayed as symbols of China given the negative reputation of dragons in other parts of the world. It is also worth noting that Chinese folklore does make a distinction between dragons and snakes, as snakes are one of the 12 animals in the Chinese zodiac, and dragons are considered a separate entity on the same zodiac. Overall, Chinese parents, by and large, would much rather prefer their child to be born during the year of the dragon than the year of the snake. Human cultural depictions of snakes are just as diverse as the snakes themselves. In Egypt, the cobra was associated with the sun god Ra, the former head of the pantheon, while the Aztecs, on the other hand, worshipped Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. The Australian Aboriginals believed in a creator deity called the rainbow snake, who creates the world as a sort of Gaia-like Earth Mother figure. And like Mother Nature, the rainbow snake both provides humans with the resources needed to survive and thrive, as well as the ability to destroy human lives. The rainbow serpent was seen as the giver of water, a fitting role on such a dry continent. In the Indian subcontinent, it had its own fascinating snake stories. Snake charming, which involves playing the punji, a wind instrument, supposedly to hypnotize the snakes, was fairly common until very recently. Due to the danger posed to humans and snakes alike, the practice was banned during the 1970s in India, but still takes place illegally in the country as well as various other countries in the Indian subcontinent and in Southeast Asia. Moving further east in India to the Nagas, which were supernatural half-human, half-snake creatures, oftentimes found in Hindu tales, usually with the body of a cobra, which could shapeshift from human to serpent, or perhaps human-serpent hybrids. With powerful and venomous bodies, the Nagas and snakes are viewed in a more positive light, seen as benevolent and awe-inspiring. Nagas have also been seen in Buddhist iconography, which makes them very popular in parts of Southeast Asia, seen in temples, fountains, and boats. These serpents again are usually depicted in a positive light similar to the Chinese dragon, not seen as fiery serpents of the Bible or medieval Europe, but rather as water dragons, and are said to have been negatively impacted by human exploitation of the environment. This sentiment is not uncommon in India and other parts of the world influenced by the subcontinent, which tend to be less anthropocentric, and by and large more nature-oriented than those that are influenced by the Abrahamic religions. Oh, and I forgot to mention that they're also the inspiration of a pretty cool race in World of Warcraft. In World of Warcraft, however, the Naga are depicted in a negative light. After all, it is a Western rendition of the Hindu myth. Now let's move on to ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, like much of Europe, you tend to see more of a negative depiction of snakes, such as that of Medusa, who bore a head full of snakes instead of hair, and she could turn men into stone just by looking at them. Going back to real history, Alexander the Great's mother, Olympias, was said to be a snake handler, which blurs the line between religious rituals and the early remnants of the exotic pet trade, which is growing in popularity to this day, with boas and corn snakes being the most popular. Throughout many cultures, snakes symbolize fertility. Snakes breed fairly easily, and I suppose their phallic symbol probably played a role in this iconography. I won't go further on that, unless I want to get demonetized. Despite causing several human deaths, they are also associated with life and healing. This is why the Greek god of medicine carried a staff with a snake, which has now become considered a symbol of modern medicine. After all, antivenom is sometimes made out of actual snake venom. Antivenom is usually made by injecting small amounts of snake venom into an animal, like a sheep or a horse, which then produces antibodies. Unfortunately, producing these antivenoms is very costly, and the antivenoms have a short shelf life. And this is especially an issue when you're dealing with rural areas in the developing world with limited ability to refrigerate these antivenoms. Some pharma companies, as a result, have been researching developing antivenoms from microorganisms in labs for drug treatments. To this day, the rod of the snake, the symbol of medicine, if you could call it that, is still associated with doctors. However, some have argued that the snake isn't actually a snake, but rather a guinea worm, which, unlike a snake, is actually evil, if you could call an animal evil. This is a worm that lays eggs in your skin, and then the babies grow out and rip out of your skin. A stick is then used to poke a small hole and pull out the worm, which is sometimes attributed to the staff. Today, guinea worms are only found in sub-Saharan Africa in the most rural areas, and are sometimes referred to as the fiery serpent. But nonetheless, the snake icon stuck, and today, the World Health Organization still uses the snake as their emblem, which I personally think is way cooler than a gross little worm. My favorite form of snake symbology is the ouroboros, also known as the snake that eats its tail. The ouroboros dates back to ancient Egypt, and has been widely adopted by the West, first by alchemists and then by religious cultists, and is still used by modern people. To the Egyptians, ouroboros represents the cyclical view of time, year by year, season by season, a notion important to a land where the Nile floods seasonally, and for agricultural societies that need to sow the fields and harvest the crops during certain periods of the year. This basically boils down to what we call the calendar. However, it is not just relegated to the years of yonder. Astrophysicist Martin Reeves has used the symbology of the ouroboros to connect the various scales of the physical universe, from the subatomic to the supergalactic. The ouroboros has oftentimes also been featured in numerous types of pop culture as well as modern political commentary. Some have referred to cancel culture as an ouroboros, as people with puritanical political ideologies will gnaw at their own movement, oftentimes destroying their own political aspirations and livelihoods in the process, for the sake of showing their own ideological and political orthodoxy and purity. Snakes have oftentimes been frequently used in political commentary, oftentimes in wartime propaganda, usually depicted as the enemy, oftentimes seen as evil and cunning. But oftentimes they are killed by a more noble animal, such as the eagle seen on the Mexican flag. Granted, there are some positive depictions, such as the Brazilian military forces during World War II, which used a snake on their insignia. Moving on to more modern times and even the future. Humanity's obsession with technology and moving forward from our natural roots has not led to a lack of interest in snakes, as snakes are unusual in their locomotion and have been used for robotic research. Snake bots are now a clear-cut example of engineers and computer scientists engaging in what is called biomimicry, in which human inventions and machines mimic biology. It is also worth mentioning that much of our inspiration from snakes is an attempt by humans to anthropomorphize snakes, and all animals in general. Snakes at the end of the day are not evil, nor are they benevolent cosmic beings. Snakes are, well, snakes, living out their lives just like any other animal, consuming their calories and making sure they spread their genes onto the next generation. One of the most fascinating creatures we co-inhabit this planet with has been a source of endless fascination for cultures all around the world, and it's quite amazing how such a relatively small, low-lying creature can inspire so much love, hate, fear, passion, and imagination all at the same time. A form of imagination that these creatures can't even fathom themselves, but nonetheless, they are able to adapt and thrive in environments across the world, even under intense human pressures. To requote my first line, a snake knows more about what is happening around the world than any other creature, because it has no ears to listen to gossip, only direct perception.